The cafeteria had always carried a low hum, forks touching plates, conversations drifting like passing breezes, but the moment the old man stumbled inside, everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the kind of quiet disturbance that slips into a room and rearranges the air without permission. He paused just past the doorway, holding the edge of a table for balance, as though steadying himself against a world that had grown faster than he could keep up with. His clothes, though clean, carried the faint dust of long travel, and his breath revealed a struggle he refused to name. People noticed him, then looked away just as quickly. An unspoken rule existed in places like this: keep walking, keep eating, keep pretending you didn't see. But the staff didn't look away. One manager, young enough to believe authority meant sharpness, moved toward him with hurried steps. She placed her hand on his arm without softness, as though she feared kindness might erase her professionalism. The old man flinched, more from surprise than pain. "You can't be here," she said quietly but firmly. "This area is for active personnel and registered families only." He tried to answer, but the words tangled somewhere between pride and breathlessness. His gaze drifted toward a far corner where a small photo on the wall caught the light, an image of a Navy unit standing shoulder to shoulder. His fingertips twitched, as if reaching for someone no longer reachable, and then he lowered his eyes again, whispering something inaudible. A few diners lifted their heads, most returned to their meals. A handful shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something about the situation felt wrong, but lacking the courage to interrupt it. The manager repeated her instruction, more loudly now, and a security guard who had been circling the back stepped closer, straightening his shoulders in the practiced way of men who prefer rules to nuance. The old man tried to turn back, but his steadiness failed him. His hand slipped from the table's edge, and his knees trembled. The security guard reached for his elbow, not gently, not cruelly, just mechanically. The old man stiffened, swallowing a humiliation so old it felt familiar. Nobody spoke, nobody intervened. Yet in the far corner of the cafeteria, 6 men had risen to their feet in the same silent, synchronized motion, so quiet and deliberate that only a few noticed at first. They were unmistakable: broad shoulders, disciplined posture, shaved faces, and the deep calm that settles into the bones of those who have seen the world unravel and learned how to stand inside ruins. Navy SEALs, not recruits, not tourists, not men who stumbled into uniforms. They carried themselves with the stillness of storms waiting for reason. They did not speak, they simply watched. The guard's grip tightened slightly on the old man's arm as the manager exhaled with impatience, urging him toward the door as though removing an inconvenience. The old man tried one last time to explain himself, his voice thin, frayed at the edges. His words dissolved into the air, unheard by everyone except the 6 men who had already begun walking forward. Each step precise, controlled, and heavy with an intention the room had not yet understood. The air changed again, but this time the shift was unmistakable. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. A faint awareness crawled across the cafeteria like the shadow of a passing aircraft. The SEALs walked in a line, not rushed, not aggressive, just steady, like men responding to a call that only they could hear. Their presence alone created a silence so profound it seemed to press on the skin. People turned, eyes widening, as if witnessing the opening move of something far larger than they could comprehend. The security guard noticed them only when they were close enough for their boots to echo in unison. He straightened instinctively, his hand loosening slightly on the old man's arm. Still, none of the SEALs spoke. They simply stood before him, 6 towering figures, calm and collected, yet their silence carried more weight than any command. And in that silence, every person in the room felt it. Something was about to change. Something long overdue. The quiet that settled between the 6 SEALs and the trembling old man was not the kind that asked for attention. It demanded it. The entire cafeteria felt suspended, as though time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. The old man's breathing grew uneven, his shoulders lifting and dropping in fragile rhythm, and the guard's hand hovered uncertainly near him, unsure whether to hold on or let go. One of the seals, a taller man with silver beginning to thread through his cropped hair, stepped forward. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the kind that came from years of knowing that strength didn't need volume. He didn't touch the old man, didn't crowd him, didn't impose. He merely positioned himself close enough that the old man could sense something solid at his side, something steady, something protective. The old man finally lifted his head, and for the first time someone looked directly into his eyes without judgment or irritation. The seal's expression carried no pity, only a depth of recognition that startled the old man into stillness. There was a story in that gaze, an understanding of battles fought long before the world stopped applauding. The manager's voice broke the moment with a strained attempt at authority. She reminded them all of regulations, of boundaries, of lists with names and categories. But her voice trembled, as though some part of her had begun to understand. She was standing in the presence of something she could neither control nor categorize. The seals remained silent. The old man's hand drifted toward the pocket of his worn jacket, fumbling for something small and rigid. The guard stiffened at the movement, instinctively alert, but the seal nearest to the old man raised a hand not in warning, but in reassurance, urging calm without a single word. Slowly, the old man drew out a folded piece of laminated paper. Its edges were soft from years of carrying it close to his heart. He held it with trembling fingers, not offering it to anyone, just holding it, as though showing the world the last piece of proof he still possessed. A few people standing nearby leaned in, recognizing the faded emblem even from a distance, a Navy service card issued decades ago, back when photographs were grainy and the world felt different. He had been young in that picture, posture straight, eyes bright with the promise of service, but time had a way of softening even the hardest lines. The old man's lips trembled as he tried again to speak, and this time his words didn't dissolve. They came slowly, fragile, but unmistakably clear. "I came to see his picture," he whispered. No one asked who he was. They didn't need to. His gaze returned to the framed photo across the cafeteria. The Navy unit standing shoulder to shoulder. The same photograph that had caught the light when he walked in. The same photograph he had stared at with a longing so deep it silenced him. The cafeteria manager's composure faltered. She looked at the photo, then back at the old man, then at the 6 seals who now watched her with a quiet that felt heavier than anger. It was the second seal, broad, shouldered, younger, carrying the calm intensity of someone who had lost more than he spoke about, who stepped forward this time. He picked up the laminated card gently, studying it with the respect one offers to sacred things. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as though the story behind it had lodged itself beneath his ribs. "You served with him," the second seal said softly, his voice barely above a breath yet unmistakably steady. "Didn't you?" The old man nodded, a single fragile motion. The room felt it, every person, every breath. The truth settling over them like dust on forgotten metals. The old man had not wandered in by mistake. He had come out of memory, out of loyalty, out of love for someone who had once stood beside him in a uniform that no longer fit his fragile frame. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reverent. The first seal glanced at the security guard, then at the manager, not with anger, but with a calm authority that made the rules feel suddenly small. Then he turned back to the old man, placing the service card back in his trembling hand with a gentleness that steadied him. "You're not leaving," he said quietly. "Not today." The old man's breath caught, and something inside him softened, as though the years had finally loosened their grip. And for the first time since he entered, he felt he was standing somewhere he belonged. The old man stood still for a moment, letting the seal's words settle into the hollow spaces carved by time. In grief, his fingers closed around the worn service card, gripping it as if it were the last thread tying him to a world that had nearly forgotten him. Across the cafeteria, the photo continued to hang under the fluorescent lights, quiet and unassuming, yet heavy with the weight of men who had once lived by unspoken vows. The 6 seals shifted slightly, forming a natural barrier around the old man, not protective in a confrontational sense, but reverent, as though guarding a flame that had burned far too long without shelter. Their stillness commanded more respect than raised voices ever could. It was the type of posture cultivated on battlefields, an understanding that the most important standoffs happen not with weapons, but with presence. The diners who had been pretending not to watch now stared openly, their guilt settling in deep. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed they had allowed a stranger, an elder someone who had once served, to be treated like an inconvenience. They wondered how many times this scene had played out in quiet corners of the world, unnoticed and unchallenged. The old man finally took a slow step toward the photo, guided not by force but by unspoken permission. His breath shook as he crossed the short distance, each movement deliberate, as though he were returning to sacred ground. The seals walked with him, keeping a respectful distance but never letting him walk alone. When he reached the frame, he lifted a trembling hand and brushed his fingertips over the glass. The image showed 2 rows of men in uniform, their faces young, unscarred, hopeful. His eyes lingered on one figure in particular, a man standing off center, smiling slightly, as though someone had said something just before the camera captured the moment. The smile carried warmth, confidence, and a promise to return that he never kept. "My boy," the old man whispered. The words were barely audible, but the silence in the room held them gently, repeating them in the hearts of everyone present. A few diners swallowed hard. Even the security guard shifted his weight, his posture no longer rigid with regulation, but softened by something more human. The oldest seal stepped closer, studying the photo with the kind of attention soldiers give to fallen brothers whose faces they've memorized through stories. "He served in my unit's lineage," he murmured. "We still honor them, all of them." The old man closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing the memories to rise. The battles fought, the promises made, the nights spent waiting for footsteps that never returned. He inhaled deeply, the scent of disinfectant and cafeteria food dissolving into distant memories of salt water, engine oil, and desert heat. He never made it home," the old man said, voice thin but steady. "And I wasn't there when they brought him back. I told myself I was too old, too far, too tired. Truth is, I was afraid I wouldn't recognize the world he died protecting." The seal nearest to him bowed his head, absorbing the confession with the quiet respect of a man who understood the cost of regret. "You came," he said gently, "that's what matters." The old man's eyes shimmered, though no tears fell. He seemed to be holding them back, as if releasing them might shatter him completely. "I promised him I'd visit this place. I promised I'd come see his picture when I could no longer visit his grave." He looked around almost apologetically, but I didn't know. I'd have to justify being here. One of the younger seals clenched his jaw, the tendons tight with controlled emotion. The injustice of it lingered in the air, the idea that a man who had given so much could be told, even for a moment, that he did not belong. The manager, who had shrunk back into a corner, lifted a tentative hand to her mouth. Her eyes glistened with remorse, the enormity of her mistake settling over her like an unwelcome weight. She had followed a rule without understanding the human behind it, and now she stood face with the consequence. But the seals did not look at her anymore. Their focus remained on the old man, whose body seemed smaller now, not from weakness but from release, as though letting the story spill out had taken years off his burdens. They did not interrupt him, they did not rush him, They simply stood with him, bound not by duty but by something older, the unspoken code of those who serve. In that quiet circle of understanding, something began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but profoundly. The old man wasn't invisible anymore. He never should have been. The old man stood before the photo as though standing at a graveside, the memories stirring in him like dust rising from a long, closed book. Around him, the 6 seals remained in silent formation, forming a kind of living perimeter, not protective in defiance, but protective in honor. They weren't shielding him from the world, they were reminding the world of who he was. His hand stayed pressed against the glass, and for a moment he seemed to drift somewhere far away. The room watched him breathe through a lifetime of echoes, of orders shouted across stormy seas, of letters written in quiet corners of barracks, of laughter shared before dawn missions, of promises carved into the marrow of men who knew the fragility of their own tomorrows. He always said he wasn't afraid to die. The old man murmured without lifting his gaze. He said dying wasn't the hard part, it was leaving behind the people who still needed him. A breath shuddered out of him, thin and trembling. But I never told him that I needed him too. One of the seals, a man with calm eyes that carried the weight of losses he rarely spoke about, stepped closer. He didn't touch the old man, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. If he could see you now, he said softly, he'd know you kept your promise. The old man's throat tightened as he lowered his hand. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in the quiet release of someone who has carried too much alone. He looked at the seals, then really looked, his gaze moving across their faces, studying the discipline etched into their posture, the humility folded into their silence, the echoes of battles they would never fully speak of. You remind me of him, he whispered, all of you, the way you stand, the way you look at the world like you know how fragile it is. The seals exchanged a glance not prideful, not boastful, but humble, the kind of acknowledgement carried by men who feel the burden of their own legacy. The oldest among them stepped slightly forward, his voice low and steady. Men like him built the ground we walk on. We don't forget that. For the first time, the old man smiled. Small, uneven, fragile, but real. A smile born not from joy, but from recognition. He had walked into this place expecting nothing more than to look at a photograph and quietly leave. Instead, he found himself standing among men who understood the language of loss without needing it translated. Behind them, the manager approached slowly, as though walking toward a truth she had been avoiding. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes on the old man, her voice barely steady. I'm sorry, she said, the words weighted with sincerity rather than obligation. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did. I didn't know. The old man looked at her, not with anger, but with a tired gentleness. Most people don't. He replied softly, it's all right, you know now. His forgiveness wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It carried more dignity than indignation ever could. One of the seals stepped beside the manager, offering her a subtle nod. Not absolution, but encouragement. She straightened her posture, realizing this moment wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding. The oldest seal turned back to the old man. Sir, he said, lowering his voice, you're staying for lunch with us. The old man blinked, surprised. For a moment he looked as though he might decline, out of habit or humility. But then something in his expression softened, something long buried beneath years of distance and silence. He nodded slowly, the acceptance fragile but genuine. The seals guided him to a table, not pushing, not ushering, simply walking with him. As he sat, the room shifted again. Conversations resumed, but quietly, respectfully. People watched from afar, not out of curiosity, but with the humbled understanding that they had just witnessed something rare. The rekindling of belonging. At the table, the old man rested his hands on the surface, breathing more evenly now. The seals sat around him, forming a quiet circle of loyalty that required no explanation. For the first time in a long while, he felt the familiar comfort of being surrounded by men who understood the silent codes of service, the ones written not in books, but in scars, vows, and memories. He looked at them one by one, his voice warm with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. The eldest seal smiled faintly. "Sir, we stand for our own." And they did, not for recognition, not for applause, but because honoring those who came before them was stitched into their bones. The old man lifted his gaze one last time toward the photo across the cafeteria. His son's smile reflected back at him, unchanged by time. But now, for the first time in years, the old man didn't feel alone standing in front of it. He had come to see his son, but he walked away reminded of something deeper. Even when time separates generations, honor never does.